The escalation of the U.S.-China trade war has been dramatic. President Trump raising tariffs on Chinese imports to 54% on Liberation Day, April 2nd. And just over a week later, the levy jumping to 125%. China retaliating with an 84% tariff on U.S. goods. Is there an end in sight for this tit for tat? Joining us now, we've got Rob Casey. He is a partner and senior analyst at Signum. We've also got Eric Winograd, the chief economist over at AllianceBernstein. Guys, thank you both for being here this morning. Rob, I want to start with you because a delay is not a cancellation. What are the next 90 days going to look like, and where will they leave us?
Yeah, thank you very much. Glad to be on. I think that over the course of the next 90 days, of course, we're going to see President Trump's team really working very hard to hammer out trade deals, right? Because he's now, as of yesterday morning, it felt as though he had lashed himself to this pole of we are going to apply the tariffs that we set out last week. Now it feels as though he's lashed himself to the opposite pole, which is we are going to eventually get to these deals, right? This is a delay. Given what sounds like President Trump's optimism that they will eventually be able to strike bilateral trade deals. Now, especially with partners like Vietnam and Japan, I think that that's relatively likely over the next 90 days. But with the EU and others, there are intractable disagreements that, frankly, we see as being very, very hard to negotiate around or negotiate through over the next 90 days.
And Rob, how are you advising clients in this moment, and how are you getting clarity on the end goal, on the objective of the president, just to get a sense of where his thinking may be heading moving forward?
Yeah, to be honest, we're telling clients not to rely on a North Star when it comes to what does President Trump want from here, right? There are sects of the President Trump team who are committed to revenue raising. There are folks who are committed to decoupling from China, not only the U.S. decoupling from China, but the global economy writ large decoupling from China. And of course, that there's probably a plurality of President Trump's team who is really committed to bringing manufacturing back to the United States. Now, I think it's important to say that in the short term, these are not, necessarily opposing goals. You can kind of have your cake and eat it too. In the longer term, that's probably not true. So to this point, it doesn't seem like President Trump himself is, operating with a singular goal, a North Star. So what we're telling clients is, understand all of these desires and all of this momentum in each direction, but don't rely on one as a simple or a singular justification for what we're going to get from here.
You mentioned a global decoupling from China. Do you think there's the possibility that the president is likely to try to get other countries to impose tariffs as well? And what might that look like?
Well, I think that if not tariffs, right, I think that President Trump, part of the negotiation is going to be we are uncomfortable with the extent to which China is operating in, X country's economy. So as an example, President Trump applied or, over the course of the past week has threatened to apply and yesterday applied and then quickly rolled off a very high tariff on Vietnam. And we've heard from President Trump's team that Vietnam may be first in line when it comes to having come to the president and saying we are ready and willing to negotiate. I think one of those negotiating points could be President Trump, am concerned about China's FDI into Vietnam. We'd like for you, Vietnam, to sort of limit that FDI, to pull that relationship back. We want your economic and trade relationships to be driven primarily by U.S. interests and not by Chinese interests. And of course, if you're sitting on the Vietnamese side of the table, that's going to be a very difficult pivot to pull off if they want to pull it off at all.
Eric, I thank you for your patience while we were getting some of our policy on with Rob here. Just talk to me about how you are viewing the economic impact of this 125% tariff on China. How are you thinking through the impact that could have on the American consumer, on American companies?
I think Stephanie is right. It doesn't matter if it's 125%, 225%, 2,025%. We're at a point now where essentially there will be no goods coming in from China, and that is a dramatic change to the economic alignment. If you think back to the post-pandemic period and the challenges that we had in rebooting supply chains, trying to recalibrate supply chains again without China involvement at all, I think is a Herculean effort that many companies will have to go through, even if in some cases it's something they might have thought about previously. And then to Rob's point, part of the answer in 2018, when the first round of tariffs was imposed, was to reshore and to have Chinese content come through countries like Vietnam. If that's not going to be possible, the challenge gets even greater. So we look at this and think that it does have a significant impact on the American economy and a significant impact on consumers. We're going to face shortages of goods that currently come only from China, and that's going to be an issue that we have to deal with.
Eric, how do you think about the timing here in the sense that there's been so much uncertainty? How are companies going to decide to shift their supply chains? Or are they just going to do it immediately because we don't really know how long these 100% plus tariffs are going to be on China, in which case it just makes sense to move out of China regardless?
I mean, I think where you have the capability to do things in more than one location, you'll choose the non-Chinese location for a period of time. But I think it's premature to assume that companies will make durable investments based on a policy environment that has swung dramatically over the course of 7 days, and to say nothing of the changes we've seen over the last 3 months. You know, a big part of what we believe to be the objective of the current administration's policy is to boost investment in the U.S. economy. I can't see that happening in the near term simply because the uncertainty is too high. And I think that the back and forth over the last week has damaged policymaking credibility significantly and may delay that sort of investment still further. You know, if I were a company, and you can think about the automakers here, many of them do have some spare capacity and the ability to run their production lines in the U.S. at greater levels, and I have no doubt they'll do that. But are you really going to rebuild a factory from somewhere else in the U.S. based on a policy that could change at the drop of a hat? The lack of a reliability, the lack of a process orientation, and the lack, as Rob said, of a clear end goal here means that it argues for conservatism, and conservatism argues for slower growth.
And Rob, I want to bring you back in here because countries, to Eric's point, countries outside of the U.S. are both afraid of alienating China and of alienating the United States. So if you're advising Ursula von der Leyen later this afternoon after this interview, Rob, what would you tell her about what the EU should be doing next strategically?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the EU is positioned in probably what may be the most difficult spot, right? Because the EU, you know, in terms of the EU economy, ties to the U.S. are incredibly important, probably more important than ties to China. But we also think at Signum that, you know, President Trump, for the most part, has been most antagonistic, at least in his rhetoric, if not tariff levels, towards the EU, right? So I think the EU is a willing partner for the United States, but Trump may not be a willing partner for the EU. So, you know, it's not to say that I think there are some countries who may be, you know, ready and willing to pivot to China if and when they have to. I would not put the EU in that camp. So it really is, if for Ursula von der Leyen and among others, it is going to be a real balancing act. And I would just say, you know, once more, what President Trump is going to ask of countries who want to engage in bilateral talks, I think in particular the EU, may just be too significant to give, right? Trump may overplay his hand. He may ask for the EU to eliminate VAT. He may ask the EU to eliminate, you know, digital services taxes, carbon border adjustment. These are things that the EU can't and probably won't want to unroll over the course of the next 90 days. And I think that's what markets have to focus on is President Trump overplaying his hand in the next 90 days in negotiations? And does that mean that 90 days hence, you know, we are back to this sort of last second uncertainty of whether tariffs will you know, be extended further, that the delay will be extended further, or in 90 days, you know, we're going to have a day just like yesterday morning?
Mm-hmm. Rob, so if the EU can't get rid of their VAT because that is a part of their tax system, what can they actually give Trump? What could a deal look like if they were to give something that would appease him such that they could actually make some sort of deal?
Yeah, so I think you kind of have to broaden the scope. We all have to broaden the scope in terms of what does President Trump want, right? Because there are of course the, you know, very specific tariff factors, which I think that probably the EU is willing to give on. There are then the non-tariff factors, again, VAT, CBAM, et cetera. I think it's very difficult for the EU to give on, frankly, any of those. And then there's other, right, non-economic. So that's, I would say, primarily defensive factors, both vis-a-vis US, EU, Russia, Ukraine, right, Eastern Europe, how Europe is approaching that situation vis-a-vis how Trump would like them to. I think that there are also probably bilateral trade deal options that look like ensuring that the EU is making purchases of things like, you know, US defensive products. Of course, we've seen the European defense sector really do quite well, given President Trump's coming back into office. So I think that there are some non, you know, barrier focused trade negotiations to be had.
Rob, Eric, thank you both so much. Really appreciate it.